Hello and welcome to News Desk. I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting.
And I'm Pablo Foley-Elias.
Is Ukraine facing a new campaign of bully diplomacy to force it into negotiations with Russia on terms it doesn't want? Is it even fair to call it bully diplomacy? Let's listen to some of the rhetoric that's been coming out of the White House over the last few days.
Would have never happened. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. He's got to say, I want to make peace. He doesn't have to stand there and say about Putin this, Putin that, and all negative things. He's got to say, I want to make peace.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
It should not be that hard a deal to make. It can be made very fast. Now, maybe somebody doesn't want to make a deal, and if somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long. It's time to end the senseless war. If you want to end wars, you have to talk to both sides.
So Donald Trump there showing everyone he's very much boss. Just around the table, we have two very special guests with us. We've got security and defence strategist Benjamin Tallis, but I'm going to be calling you Ben. I hope that's OK.
Hi, Alex. Good to be with you.
And we have Richard Walker, DW's chief international editor. So just before we start, obviously we've got some time to discuss this. Bully diplomacy, is that what we're seeing, Ben?
If we are, it's a bully who's not so much in the China shop, but who risks making it China's world. This is, as a bully tactic, if that's indeed what it is, it's really playing to the dark side, and it's unbecoming of a leading democracy. I don't think it's a strategy, though. I think it's just a symptom of that move to actually a more authoritarian stance from Trump.
Richard?
I mean, I guess, yeah, people talk about using sticks and carrots in diplomacy or all sorts of negotiations. And I think what people are kind of struggling with is that it seems that towards Ukraine, it's all stick and no carrot, and towards Russia, it's all carrot and no stick.
Yeah. Good point. So we'll certainly be talking a little bit more about Russia as well when we bring in our correspondent from Ukraine. I'll introduce him in a bit. But first of all, back to you, Ben, just so that we properly introduce you so you don't think that we are not being too polite. You were with us, actually, almost a year ago, I think, to the day. So it's very nice to have you back. But you weren't in the studio with us. You are now, so thank you. I've said that you are a security and defence strategist, but actually you are also director of the Democratic Strategy Initiative, and you're also an author. So that's just some of the jobs that you are doing at the moment. That's correct, yeah.
Very, very kind of you, Alex. Thank you for that generous introduction.
Well, thank you very much for being with us.
And Richard, of course, is DW's chief international editor. You're familiar to News Desk. You've joined us before, so great to have you back as well. And also around the table, we have Nehal Johri, who will be bringing us up to date on the changing story.
Ever-changing story.
That's an understatement, to say the least. And we'll also have some data for us as well in a little while from now.
And I did just mention him, but a little bit later we will be joined by Nick Connolly. He is our correspondent in Kyiv. He'll be obviously trying to dissect what President Zelensky is going through, has been facing over the past few days, and what the situation there is on the ground.
And we can't forget one very special person, of course, Cherry Chan, who's normally sitting around the desk, but actually she's behind the scenes today. But she will be keeping an eye on all the comments, and she's been sending the comments already over to me, and I'll be reading them out and asking your questions to our guests on our panel today. And actually, I've already got some, because people have already been commenting on our post on YouTube, on our community post. Here's one from RH9194. Trump only cares about saying he got a ceasefire. Putin will violate any treaty if allowed. peace through strength. Another one, Kappa 1865, stay with Europe. We're currently the only ones who can see the difference between offender and defender. And of course, we can wrap up this war in no time. Russia is already at breaking point unless Trump lifts sanctions, etc., which will truly be unforgivable. And one very quick one, Arcades Coit, if Europe is so concerned about Russia, why don't they send troops to help Ukraine? Instead, they use Ukrainian men to fight for them while they sit back and watch from afar. So plenty of comments coming in, and I've seen some more that are coming in, and I'll be reading those out throughout the show.
And you've got a poll for us as well.
And, of course, I have a poll. Sorry, I forgot, because Cherry normally does this part, but, of course, I will read it out this week. So we, as usual, had a big chat about what our poll question should be, and we decided that this would be the most appropriate this week. What's the one thing Ukraine shouldn't back down on in peace talks? We have 4 possible answers. The first one, keeping all its territory, its ambition to join NATO, getting US security guarantees, or no concessions, period. So please do vote in our poll, and of course we'll be bringing the results later on in the show.
Thank you very much, Pablo. So, of course, the past few days have been a whirlwind. The US administration, what's going on in Ukraine. And to try to bring us as up-to-date as we can possibly be at this moment in time, we have Nihal. Where do we begin?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
It has been a whirlwind, and what I'm going to do is take everyone through 6 things that have happened in the last 6 days in this world, again, of Trump diplomacy, and all of it has to do with Ukraine's future. So, first of all, we have to begin with the Oval Office meeting between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy that happened on Friday last week. I'm sure everyone in our audience has seen that clip of the clash that unfolded, but we're still going to play one segment of it, not just because it's a great example of what we're referring to as perhaps bully diplomacy, but also because try and observe that what Trump is saying is actually reiterating Russia's talking points. Let's watch.
I know. You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
you
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this cabinet.
We gave you, through
I
this
said,
stupid president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military
president.
equipment,
You
and your
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
Yes. What about West?
If you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me.
equipment,
You invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak.
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3
okay?
days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks, of course he has.
Oh,
You hear it there. Zelensky clearly calls him out on that, right? But anyway, this meeting is seen as this great falling out moment between Ukraine and the US. A day later, Zelensky goes to London to hold a meeting with European leaders, and he meets Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, and several other key European leaders. We have some pictures from there. Do we see it yet?
There they are.
There you go. So that's Keir Starmer hugging Zelensky. And another one where we see here's Emmanuel Macron as well in the meeting. And if you notice, it's just such a different body language compared to the meeting in the US, right? There's this warm embrace, almost a show of European unity. And it came with the promise that the UK would stand behind Ukraine as long as needed. Well, in all of this, of course, we can't forget that US support is very essential to this war. And so we go back to that catastrophic meeting. What was the fallout of that meeting? That the first thing was that the US stopped aid to Ukraine.
which is a monumental decision, wasn't it? That
Although not unexpected. I think the confirmation overnight that they're stopping intelligence sharing is actually more immediately damaging and will have a bigger impact. You're jumping the gun.
You're
Sorry,
jumping the
Alex.
gun.
Yeah, this was something that was confirmed by White House officials, and they said that the aid would resume once Trump determined that Ukraine was committed to peace negotiations with Russia. This is something Trump has said repeatedly, that Ukraine is ready for a peace deal, but President Zelensky is not. Which brings us to number 4, Zelensky, right? He wants to control the damage that has been caused by the Oval Office meeting. And so he first tweeted saying that no one wants an endless war. He wrote a letter to Donald Trump. And he said that Ukraine is ready for any sort of minerals deal. I'm just going to read out what Zelensky said. His tweet says, "Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened that way. It is time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive." Now, Trump gets this letter and he responds to it while speaking to the US Congress. This was a marathon meeting where he spoke about a lot of things. Ukraine was just one of the topics.
Yeah, because he spoke for an hour and 40 minutes or so, didn't he? I mean, it really was a marathon.
And with respect to this letter, he said he appreciates it, but we're going to listen to what he actually said.
I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago. Simultaneously, we've had serious discussions with Russia and have received strong signals that they are ready for peace. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Wouldn't that be beautiful?
Wouldn't that be beautiful? Wow.
Yeah, there's Trump again, basically referring to Russia's idea of peace. And now, coming to day 6, we've just heard a few hours back that the US has barred UK from sharing any military intelligence with Ukraine. That came in just a few hours ago. We have a clip here from the front page of the Financial Times.
And it has been confirmed now, hasn't it, that that is the case. And it's not just the UK, but the US has said...
That's right. So the head of CIA has confirmed that in speaking to an American network, to Fox Business, I believe. So, but I think the term they used was pause, you know, which is also the term that they used about the military aid. And we're getting kind of a lot of different messages all at the same time, yeah? And then we had Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, indicating, well, as you just said, Nehal, that maybe they would lift that pause on the military aid if there was, you know, some move towards talks. So, yeah, it's a very dynamic situation at the moment.
Well, those are our 6 things, and that's everything that's happened just between Friday and Wednesday. So if you think life moves slowly, you know, you're wrong.
No, absolutely.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? I mean, we've had shouting matches, and that was we only showed a small part of what happened in the Oval Office. It was quite incredible for people who actually watched that whole section of that meeting, also with J.D. Vance. We've got letters being passed now. I mean, I guess my main question is, have we ever seen this kind of diplomacy in public before? We know it obviously goes on behind closed doors, but the fact that we've all been witnessing this in real time, it seems extraordinary to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, anyone watching that clip and putting themselves through watching the whole thing, which is a really hard watch for anyone who cares about freedom, anyone who cares about democracy and cared about the image of the United States, actually, I think would conclude it's not bully diplomacy, it's just bullying. But the cruelty is part of the point. And this is part of the purpose. It's a performative act to show we don't care and we will do what is necessary to pursue our goals. Now, I think the question the West and indeed Ukraine has to ask itself is, are those the same goals we have? And I think you put it very well, Nihal, when you said this is Putin's idea of peace. This is Russia's idea of peace that Trump is alluding to. It's not one that anyone in Europe should subscribe to, and certainly not one that Ukrainians will subscribe to. But it's worth noting that Zelensky was magnanimous, was again a leader who cares about doing what is needed to be done for his country and his people, eating humble pie, taking one for the team. And he's that kind of leader. But I don't think he should give too much to this because I don't think the goals are actually compatible.
Just before we bring in Nick from Ukraine, Richard, I'd just love to get your take on this, the fact that this has been so public and has been, as Ben has just said, it's not bully diplomacy, it's just bullying.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you know, that was a great rundown of 6 things in 6 days, but you could go back a few more days and other extraordinary things happening, like at the vote at the United Nations, where the United States voted against, in the UN General Assembly, against a motion that condemned Russia's invasion. And the United States didn't support it. It didn't just abstain from it. It voted against it together with Russia. Yeah. I mean, even China didn't do that. China abstained. And China, just a few months ago, the Americans under Biden were complaining constantly that China was providing all of this support for Russia in its war. It's diplomatic support, economic support, certain amount, and Ben would be the expert on this, on the level of kind of support in terms of dual-use goods that could contribute to the war effort. But even China, with all of that support for Russia, didn't vote in against this motion in the United Nations. And for the United States to do that against all of its NATO allies, against all of its previous allies, and other countries voting for that were what, North Korea, Belarus, client state, Hungary, Israel. I mean, some quite interesting constellations emerging here. So I mean, that could have been also in the list. So there's really a lot of quite, unusual, as you say, very, very transparent, very visible kind of dynamic here. But also acts, a vote like that is an action. It's not just words, it's not just talking, it is actually an action.
I mean, there are weeks when decades happen, and it seems like we've had a couple of them in a row.
It really does feel like
the
that.
middle of this century, I think, at this stage.
Yeah, and I think, and I suppose, I mean, you see that the Europeans are quite taken aback by this pace of things. And of course, I mean, the world's had one Trump term already, and we remember that from the first Trump term as well, that, it had this kind of rapid succession of things. But I think the stakes are so high now, the world was in a much, it was a calmer world at that time. We haven't even mentioned the fact that, I'm kind of following some of the news wires here on the laptop as we talk. It's not just this going on. Trump has also launched tariffs yesterday against Canada and Mexico. Then they saw the stock market kind of taking a plunge. Then his Commerce Secretary last night was saying, well, maybe we find a compromise already the next day. Now there's...
Although taking time out to try and bully the Premier of Ontario, who stood his ground.
So
it's a big guy to stand his ground, too. You wouldn't mess with Doug Ford, I think.
So I mean, it's not just sort of three-dimensional chess in one game. There's multiple games going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get in just before we go to Nick, Alex, if you don't mind, because obviously this topic is... It really makes people want to kind of comment because in many respects it affects all of us, right? And I just have a couple of comments here from Himanshu Ambani, who says Ukraine has no chance if the USA backs out and is just a pawn in a bigger geopolitical game. Another viewer, Wayne, says, I think a ceasefire is possible, but long-term peace is not. And then one more here, which is an interesting one from Nilay Chaturvedi. Ukraine can survive the rest of 2025 without the United States, without USA aid, but beyond that, impossible. Even if Americans don't force it, Ukraine can't continue to destroy their country on a wish of getting back their land.
It's important to clarify a couple of things there. Ukraine can survive without US aid. It will be a lot more difficult, but the Europeans can step in and can provide a lot of what is missing. Not like for like in some cases, but effect for effect. They can actually do a lot to make sure Ukraine survives. And indeed, I think the only way to sustainable peace in Europe, it's widely accepted now by many European leaders, is for Russia to be defeated. And this is the issue. Any ceasefire that gives in, rewards and emboldens Russia will only put off the next phase of the war and give Russia time to reconstitute its forces, putting more of us here in Europe at direct risk.
OK, on that note, let's bring in Nick Connolly. He is joining us from Kyiv, our correspondent there. Hi, Nick. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us. Great to have you back on again. It really has been a hell of a week for Zelensky, hasn't it?
Well, not just a week, I'd say probably 2 weeks if you include the first kind of Trump team visit to Kyiv, which was the Treasury Secretary Besant, who apparently thought he could tell Ukraine's president to sign the deal about the rare earths there and then, sign on the dotted line. That was when it still had the sum of $500 billion as what supposedly Ukraine owes the US, even though that's much more than Ukraine has ever received from the US. And apparently bystanders, people there in the presidential office could hear the shouting with Zelensky giving him a dressing down there and then. Trump obviously wasn't too happy about that, complained that Besant had made the long trip to Kyiv and had been treated nastily. And after that, we had the dictator comment. We had Zelensky pushing back, saying that Trump was surrounded by Russian disinformation. And then, obviously, the meltdown on Friday in the Oval Office. I think that we have seen, obviously, Zelensky trying to kind of build bridges, a lot of pressure on him from Europeans to do that. But I think in terms of the actual kind of terms of anything he's going to agree to, I don't think he's going to go too far towards what Trump wants. And I think that's not just about Zelensky, that's any Ukrainian leader who, has any sense of the kind of history of Ukraine's attempts to have ceasefires with the Russians. They don't work for the most part unless there is a real guarantee. I mean, just as a kind of reminder, when Zelensky came in 2019, his whole kind of shtick was about ending the kind of long drawn-out conflict with Russia in Donbass. He said we just have to stop shooting. and he was widely mocked for that kind of opinion. He then met Putin with Macron and Merkel in Paris and was visibly crushed because his kind of heart-to-heart with Putin hadn't worked. Putin still demanding kind of, his kind of full aim. So I think there's going to be significant pushback. I think we're in a kind of lull now in an attempt to kind of patch things up, but I don't see this ending anytime soon.
OK, just before we go on, Nick, let's just listen to Volodymyr Zelensky. He was talking last night. He was basically saying that what happened at the White House last Friday in the Oval Office was regrettable. Let's just have a listen.
We seek constructive cooperation and true partnership. What happened at the White House, instead of our planned negotiations, was regrettable. But we must find the strength to move forward, respect one another, as we have always respected America, Europe, and all our partners, and work together to bring peace closer. I'm grateful to everyone who supports Ukraine in this.
So Zelensky there talking about wanting constructive cooperation with the US and wanting to move forward. And also we know, Nick, that he wrote this letter to Donald Trump, which Donald Trump was referring to when he spoke to Congress last night. It didn't go as far as an apology, but still this was a big step forward for Zelensky, wasn't it?
Well, we've just actually heard in the last kind of couple of hours from the Ukrainian side that there was no letter, that Trump was just referring to this tweet. Seemingly there wasn't an additional letter. But yes, obviously he talked about Trump's strong...
Sorry, Nick, there we were thinking that it might have been like a Keir Starmer moment where, brings out the letter, but no letter. OK, thank you for correcting us on that. So he's just referring to the tweet that Nihal brought up earlier then.
In Trump world, surely
in
a
Trump
tweet
world.
is as good
I mean,
as
maybe...
right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's printed out.
I mean, maybe they print out the tweets for him. Yeah, so, yeah.
No, sorry, carry on, Nick. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
In terms of the kind of patching up, yes, I think we've seen him trying to flatter Trump, talking about the fact that it was Trump who gave Ukraine the Javelin missiles in his first term, talking about strong leadership, but he hasn't gone kind of, fully kind of craven on his knees as probably the Trump team would want. He's just not that kind of person who's going to do that, however much maybe the Europeans kind of hope that he would. So I think we've seen for now as much as he's going to give. Let's see if that works, if that's enough to keep Trump happy. There's been now suggestions that the next kind of visit to patch things up is going to be with chaperones, essentially, maybe with Macron and Starmer, some kind of fairly differing kind of stories, some saying that it's happening, some denials, but certainly I think there's a sense that the Europeans are not going to allow Zelensky and Trump to kind of meet alone again.
Yeah.
Hi, Nick, it's Pablo here. I'm actually laughing at that use of chaperones.
Yeah.
It's a nice image that you're giving us.
Earlier. It's exactly right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, then, you mentioned earlier, and in fact Ben did as well, that you don't think that, Zelensky, that they're going to accept too much. I just want to kind of get an idea of where we are on this talk of a peace deal. We know that it involves minerals, which would be obviously good for the US, but can you explain exactly where we are on this, or do we not know?
So this to me, sorry, the line's a bit dodgy.
Yes, Nick.
Didn't hear it. All good. So, who knows is the answer to that. I mean, we've had so many drafts of this mineral deal, right? So at the beginning, there was talk of $500 billion. There was also talk of, supposedly exclusion of other countries, European companies, from these Ukrainian critical and rare earth metals, basically giving kind of, unique privileges to US business here in Ukraine without any guarantees in terms of Ukraine's future security, right? There's just all that talk from the Trump team about the fact that US investments are basically the same thing as a security guarantee, and that somehow Vladimir Putin isn't going to come into Ukraine again if there is US business here. Most people here in Kyiv don't buy that. They say, the American companies don't care as long as they have access to their mines. If Putin allows them to carry on working, then they don't care if Ukraine loses its sovereignty. So that's not something that, cuts much, with kind of, anyone here in Kyiv. In terms of the kind of mechanics of how America would get money back, there's talk of some kind of fund, so 50% of all the profits from new projects in oil, gas and these critical and rare earth metals, they would then go into this fund, and then somehow that would go to America. But whether that money then is reinvested in Ukraine and just becomes kind of future US investment here, or if it's sent to America, no one knows. This was all basically just kicked down the road. They just agreed to keep on talking and negotiate in the future. So this was basically to give Trump a quick win and then hope to negotiate for kind of more kind of acceptable terms for Ukraine later on. When the first draft came out, you had the Europeans saying that this was basically economic colonization, that these were kind of the terms that you would apply to a country that you had beaten in a war and that you were occupying, rather than a country that you were in any kind of alliance or kind of friendly terms with. So certainly this was all pretty scary, and it's kind of a project of Zelensky's that went a bit too well, because this was actually something that Zelensky suggested last year in the hope to kind of get Trump interested, and seemingly it worked a bit too well.
So what do you think Ukraine would accept then, in terms of any deal and any talks of peace?
Well, so that's the minerals deal. In terms of kind of ceasefires or kind of peace deal, I think there have to be real guarantees. There have to be some kind of peacekeepers. There have to be commitments to supply Ukraine, if not maybe at the same level that it has been in the last few years, but on a kind of comparable level, to allow Ukraine to make it really an unattractive proposition to the Russian side to attack again. I think the kind of consensus opinion, even among people who are very critical of Zelensky, is that this is crucial, because otherwise this country will just, basically collapse after the fighting ceases. Everyone who has a chance will leave the country. There's an expectation that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of men will join their wives, their children in Europe, because people are just not willing to, rebuild and then have Putin coming in again a couple of years later. So some kind of really kind of serious commitment, not just promises on paper, boots on the ground and air support. That is something that I think the Ukrainians are going to play hardball for, and not just allow Russia, as the other guests have said, to rebuild its army and then come back a few years later.
Let me just ask, I was just going to say, is that realistic to talk about boots on the ground when we know that Trump has made it very clear that he doesn't want to even put down security guarantees for Ukraine?
Yeah, it's not realistic, and I don't actually think it's the biggest issue, though, because at the moment, not even NATO countries can count on the US security guarantee. So why would Ukraine trust a US security guarantee under this president? I think it's worthless, frankly speaking, and I don't think it's something that we should be aiming for in any way. It's up to the Europeans to step in and do what they can to secure Ukraine. Now, there is a debate about whether that's best done through boots on the ground or whether it's best done through arming Ukraine to the teeth with the kind of long-range and battlefield precision strike weapons that could effectively obliterate Russia's governing industrial and warfighting capacity. And so there are ways of doing this that would be a bit smarter than just boots on the ground. But boots on the ground has important because it shows you've got skin in the game.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to jump in. I just found it very interesting, the sort of practicalities of it, in which we haven't been talking about enough. What Nick just said there, which is fascinating, which is, that people would just leave the country, essentially, if there aren't those security guarantees. And I don't think we're talking about that enough,
This has been in the air and in the expert discussion for a good couple of years, and it's why we've been long advocating for a deal that would actually give Ukraine a future. Without a viable future, in terms of security and in terms of economic reconstruction, in terms of institutional memberships of the European Union, for example, why would Ukrainians live there without a future? And that's something Europeans need to consider is, do they want Ukrainians to be in Ukraine, rebuilding Ukraine, or do they want more Ukrainians coming into our countries and living here? There's a big issue there, even for people who are very pro-migration, how we would handle that, given the current state of our migration policy, given the current state of our own societies to deal with. What we have to fundamentally understand is that Ukraine's security is intimately connected with our own. And if we don't get Ukraine's security right, we won't get our security right either.
And when you say our, you mean Europe's?
I mean Europe, yeah.
I mean, you're echoing what the Baltic states have been saying, essentially, right? I mean, the Prime Minister of Finland even was saying yesterday, I believe, he was basically saying that, he said, we have to guarantee our own security and focus on that, so...
Yeah, the Baltics, the Nordics, the Czechs, the Poles. There's quite a few people in Brussels, von der Leyen being one of them, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. They've got this for some time. And it's why, the 27th of February is known here as the Titanwende speech day. The biggest speech happened in Brussels when von der Leyen said they're one of us and they belong with us. And it was that was showing how intimately connected it is. She and others have faced an uphill battle, though, to get this accepted and get it acted on. Now I think there's a greater willingness to do so because Europeans have seen the unreliability of Trump, have understood that we're dependent on something we can't depend on. Yeah. And so they have to take care of this.
Richard, just want to bring you in at this moment. What do you think Trump really wants out of this? When we're talking about Ukraine, we know about the minerals. We have actually got a map which we could show at some point, but we know about minerals. But you know, the fact that this is so fluid, changing by the hour, as we've even said, you know, we're talking about cutting off intelligence sharing, pausing aid, maybe they will, you know, revisit that. But what do you think fundamentally he wants?
Well, so yeah, I mean, things are moving fast and things are unpredictable, but in some senses, Trump can be very consistent over time in his messaging and his statements. And he said for a long time he wants this war to stop. You know, so I was in the US in the autumn covering the election there, and you know, went to some events, and you know, he would always talk about this, and he would always have the same lines. You know, this war would never have started if I'd remained president. You know, this is a terrible war, needless death. I want to stop it. You know, and he was saying for the longest time, I will stop it within 24 hours. So obviously, you know, it hasn't gone that fast, and we don't know what's going to happen. But this has been. It's been a pretty consistent point of his for a long time that he wants this war to stop. And when you build up something like that, and he says he wants it to stop it fast, of course, by doing that, you pretty much lose some of your leverage and tools to get a really good settlement, because you are indicating you want it done quickly. You know? Yeah. I mean, neither Putin nor Zelensky has really said, oh, I really want this to end quickly. You know, both of them, you know, still want to stick out for more than they would potentially have now. So it's Trump who seems to be in a hurry. And then, of course, the question, well, why is he in such a hurry? Well, partly, you know, it's partly his reputation is obviously staked on this idea that he can end it soon. So he needs to for his own reputation. But also, well, what does he want? Why does he want it to end? You know, and I think, you know, some people would say, well, you know, Trump genuinely doesn't like wars. You know, some have said this is, you know, one of the positive aspects of his character when people are looking at him, that he does generally seem to not like wars. But I think there's a more interesting kind of theories about, well, what does he want to, you know, why does he want it to end? What's his strategy beyond that? And that this maybe relates to his idea of what kind of relationship he can have with Russia.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, there's a couple of theories on that, aren't there? There's the sort of so-called reverse Kissinger, right?
So we're working on a production at the moment here, trying to kind of sort out and filter out, like, what are the potential interpretations of what he's doing. It seems like, you know, at the very least, some would argue, okay, he's taking a realist view that this war can't really get anyone anywhere. It's entered this corrosive phase of each side just kind of dug in, people being killed, not getting anywhere, and it contributes to an extremely corrosive relationship with Russia that is needlessly corrosive. And that if you had an improved relationship with Russia, then it could, you know, present economic opportunities, you know, it could reduce risk of conflict between Russia and NATO, and take this further, then maybe you could try to put some distance between Russia and other adversaries, whether it's Iran or the big one would be China. Yeah, and this is where people talk about this would be a reverse Nixon. You know, so Nixon and his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, famously in the 1970s, engineered this diplomatic thaw with China, trying to put more distance between China and Russia. Many experts, though, point to the fact that China and Russia already had a massive split by that point. They'd even fought a war. So all it was putting more distance between them. Right now, there is virtually no distance between China and Russia, and they have, you know, very, very good structural reasons for having a close relationship.
Yeah, OK. Very interesting. And we've just talked about Russia then. Nick Connolly, if you are still with us. Yes, you are. Thank you very much, Nick. I know it's can be quite cold on out there in Kyiv, so thanks for being with us. Richard there was just talking about Russia. So it feels like that is the big elephant in the room here. Clearly there must be big questions in Ukraine and elsewhere, but in Ukraine, as to why is Trump appearing to bend over backwards for Russia and doing everything to accommodate Vladimir Putin?
I mean, if you live here in Ukraine and you're friends with people here, you've been getting, over the last few days and weeks, lots of links and lots of stories sent to you on WhatsApp about potential links, Russian oligarchs that Donald Trump supposedly made money from selling them real estate in the 90s, 2000s, that he's been seen having dinner with over the years. There is a very big part of Ukrainian society that sees it as Trump, if not being a Russian agent, but being someone who is just financially ad hoc, ad hoc to the Russian kind of state or the kind of oligarchs that surround it. I think that's just an attempt to try and explain things in a hurry. But broadly, if you look at kind of the kind of statements coming out of Russia over the last couple of weeks, there is no sense that they've in any way changed their position or any way willing to come to some kind of peace or at least ceasefire that is in any way different from what they were offering at the beginning of the war. They're still talking about basically reducing the Ukrainian army, limiting the numbers of soldiers so that basically Ukraine can't defend itself from Russia, let alone NATO. Even in some people around the Kremlin kind of doubting whether EU membership is acceptable to Russia nowadays, saying that Ukraine would have to even give up territory that it still controls, that Russia has kind of annexed according to its constitution, so places like Kherson. So they really are playing hardball at least, but there's a real sense here that the Russians still want to carry on fighting, want to take Kyiv, and that they're just basically trying to sit it out now while Trump does his kind of diplomatic whirlwind, and then hope that it's Ukraine that gets blamed for the talks not working out, and then hope that US support to Ukraine falters, as has happened, and then they can just bite off more. So there is a real sense here that the Russians are being pretty clever about their strategy and are just kind of keeping quiet, implying maybe to Trump that they are willing to do some deal, maybe offering him some concessions, some hot air about their ties to Iran or China, and demanding really kind of practical things in return on the ground in Ukraine.
It's really fascinating. I'm going to jump in there, Nick, because we're getting a lot of questions and comments, obviously, on what we're talking about at the moment. But I actually have one from one of our favourite viewer, Karolina Vilena, who wants to ask you, Nick, how do people in Ukraine feel about what happened to their president?
So our colleagues were out on the streets talking to people about that, and it was pretty hard to find anyone who was very critical of Zelensky. One or two maybe said that what he said was right, but maybe he should have not said it in public. But the vast majority of people saying that he had no other choice, that otherwise he was going to be kind of bullied to a pulp, was going to be humiliated like the King of Jordan was, and that with Trump, that doesn't make a difference if you stand up for yourself, you don't, the result is the same, so you might as well stand up for yourself. And lots of people actually saying that they're actually kind of happy that it happened in public, because they were assuming that this kind of thing was already happening behind closed doors, and at least that way the whole world saw it, the Europeans saw it, and are now kind of forced in some kind of action.
Yeah, it's interesting. And just one other comment on the issue of territory, because obviously a lot of people are commenting on this issue. It's I think, close to the heart of many people when they put it into the context of their own country, will say. And Fran is saying that there's no way Ukraine will regain all its territory in a peace deal. It makes me sad, but that's the sad truth. Now, I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but that's certainly the sentiment that we're seeing from a lot of people.
Because just
commenting.
a reminder, Nick, that at the moment Russia has taken around 20% of Ukraine's territory. That's correct, isn't it?
We're just seeing the map there now.
We're just seeing the map
but,
there.
Yeah.
Yes. Nick, please.
But I mean, also there's a difference. But there's a difference between kind of signing away Crimea and all the bits that Russia has annexed or controls right now, and just basically freezing it and kind of saying, okay, we'll deal with that sometime in the future. So I think Ukraine, Zelensky is not suggesting that America, Europe, anyone sends troops here to help Ukraine take back Donetsk and Crimea. That is not on the table. But they are not going to sign it away and legitimize Russian control of these territories. That's the difference.
And just to clarify that map, so Michał, if we can just show that map again, that would be great. Yeah. Just to confirm then that the pink is the territory that Russia now controls. Exactly. And all those different colours are where Ukraine is said to have minerals and rare earths. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so if you look at rare earths, that's the bright green.
Yeah.
And you see it sort of splattered across the country. Yeah.
Yeah, just so that, just to clarify that for everyone. Thank you very much, Nick. Just before we let you go for this section, you talked about people on the streets of Kyiv responding to that Oval Office meeting, but also the team has been out speaking to people after the US decided to pause that military aid to Ukraine. We can just listen to those. I think we've got about 4 vox pops, but it would just be good to get your take on that, Nick, once we've listened to those.
I still think we can win, but we'll need more help from Europe.
America has become a selfish country. They're dropping Ukraine and they're dropping Europe. We need to get closer to Europe.
Our leaders are to blame for most of it. We're so dependent on outside support. They should have been more diplomatic.
I'm happy that America has stopped the aid, because that will stop the war. If you stop refueling a car, eventually it will stop.
Very interesting vox pops there. Particularly, we were talking about that the last one, the last man who we had there saying that he's happy that the US has stopped aid because it will stop the war. Is that a genuine feeling on the streets of Kyiv, Nick?
I'd say that's pretty rare. I mean, we left it in because it was unusual and interesting, because you normally don't hear these kinds of things. I don't think that's in any way a kind of majority opinion. Sure, there are those people, but for the most part, yeah, it's a question that there's kind of largely agreement from most people that the content that Zelensky pushing for security guarantees, be that from America, from Europe, is the right thing to do. Question about whether he should have bitten his tongue and given Trump the kind of praise that Trump expects. That's a different thing. But there were lots of other people we spoke to who were saying that even if the military aid stops, does that mean we're going to stop fighting? Does it mean that the soldiers on the front lines are going to give in? No, it's going to be harder. It's going to be more painful. But no one promised us that things would be easy. This is an uneven fight between countries with very different populations and resources. But I think there is a sense here why have we fought for 3 years if we're just going to give up and give Russia everything that they were demanding at the beginning? That is not something that anyone here for now can really imagine.
Nick, thanks very much. We'll just let you have a pause for a few moments, if that's OK, and we will come back to you in a little bit. Ben, I just wanted to pick up with you on that, with what Nick was just saying then, particularly about Ukrainians saying that we haven't gone this far just to now give in and give up to Russia.
Well, absolutely, and it relates to the last comment that we heard in the Vox Pop. It relates to what Pablo was saying about territory and to the map that we saw. Because territory is part of it, but it's the people on that territory that is actually the real key, because we've seen what Russia does in places that it occupies. We're talking torture, we are talking rape, we are talking mass killings, we're talking the destruction of any kind of civilized society. So when we talk about Ukraine getting its territory back, it's also about the people who live there being able to live in a free society rather than under that kind of barbaric rule. And I think that's really important to emphasize. The gentleman there who spoke at the end is in Kyiv, which is not Russian-controlled. And so it might be quite easy for him to say that. It would be less easy for people in the occupied areas, I think, to say the same thing, unless they are supporting Russia's case, which is not so many of them. There's another important point to emphasize, though, in relation to what the Americans are doing here. And we're used to seeing America as an ordering actor in the world, as a force for good, a misguided good at times that makes mistakes, goes too far. We've seen plenty of criticism of the Iraq War, for example, and rightly so. But I think what we're now starting to see is America as a disordering actor. And we're starting to see Trump actually tearing down the last remnants of the liberal international order. We see disruption at home with what Vance and Musk are doing. We see disruption abroad. And it's interesting, this point about China and Russia and trying to split them off, because if you put that together with what Hegseth has announced, the defense secretary, about cutting the Pentagon budget, that points towards an American retrenchment into its own so-called sphere of influence, which is a might makes right type concept. We rule over this part of the world and the rest who are in it just have to accept it, and leaving Russia to their sphere and leaving China to theirs.
Richard, I don't know if you want to respond to that. I mean, I know we were talking a bit more geopolitics earlier when we were talking about China, Russia and relations with the US as well.
Yeah, so, I mean, that is the third kind of theory that goes out there. So, yeah, we had the theory of the kind of a realist revolution where Trump wants to have a productive relationship with Russia and sees this war as a waste of blood and treasure. There's the idea of trying to put a wedge between Russia and China. And the third idea is this one where it kind of goes to a kind of a global carve-up between the superpowers, essentially saying, well, you know, the US is dominant in the Western Hemisphere, Russia is dominant in at least Eastern Europe and maybe more, depending, of course, on how things would go, and China is dominant in East Asia and perhaps the wider Indo-Pacific. I mean, I think one thing that sort of kind of chimes with that is this this impression that we've had from a long time from Donald Trump that he respects kind of great powers, he respects authoritarian styles of leadership. He's talked about this for a long time. And that he evidently does not have really an interest in pursuing justice in the resolution of the Ukraine war. That justice is secondary to just kind of finishing it. So he's not really concerned about the fate of Ukraine. And I think what people are worried about in Asia is, well, you know, can you say the same thing about Taiwan, which would be, of course, the major flashpoint in Asia between the United States and China, potentially. And a lot of what Trump has said about Taiwan has been very derogatory. But I think here it's interesting because you do get conflicting messages from other figures within the administration, many of whom, for which, you know, China is the absolutely prime challenge to the United States position globally, and that the logic of calming things down with Russia really is about being able to then fully focus on China, and that Taiwan is too important still to the US economy. It's too important to the pipeline of chips that, you know, go into AI, for instance. NVIDIA and Apple, both highly dependent on this one Taiwanese company, TSMC. So it would be too damaging to US interests, economic and strategic and technological, to kind of sign off Taiwan at this stage. But maybe in a couple of years, you know, TSMC just in the last, the last 2 of Nehal's 6 days, announced significantly increased investments in the US to build more chip fabrication plants there. The more TSMC, you know, builds chip fabrication plants outside Taiwan, the more vulnerable Taiwan looks.
Right, it weakens the so-called silicon shield.
Yeah. So, but it feels like, I mean, what Ben describes there, this kind of sphere of influence deal between the great powers, feels like it chimes with Trump's worldview, but it might be premature for that in terms of a really kind of cold-eyed
jump in there very quickly because it's sort of, this is a lot of the comments and it's very much related to this and what we have mentioned before, but a lot of people are saying, okay, well then, one comment here from John Jacob, well then why doesn't the EU step up and, for example, offer those guarantees? Another comment from Carolina again, exactly to Ben, EU must step up for Ukraine and not depend on the US. Security guarantees from the US is wishful thinking. EU must get its act together. And we're seeing lots and lots of comments in this direction. The real question here is, can European governments face their populations and ask them to bear further higher costs of living, inflation, etc.? There is no appetite for war. So it's interesting to see that, you know, essentially our viewers as well are seeing that there has to be a shift as well.
Yeah, I'm glad the people are with me on that one. That's always encouraging, and a big thanks to all the DW viewers out there. The question for European leaders is, are they going to be honest enough to explain to our populations the cost of not standing up? Because this sphere of influence model and carving up the world sounds like, you know, grand geopolitical chess game, etc. The consequences of it, if you're not living in a great power, are catastrophic. This is empire. This is the return of empire. It is the return of subjugation. It is might makes right. So smaller countries in the Baltics, we mentioned before, are acutely aware of this. In many of the large Western European countries, they're not, because they have colonial histories which they were on the other side of. Be prepared to be on the receiving end of the imperial boot. That's the world that we face if we don't actually stand up. And Europe can indeed be a great power. It could be one that combines power with values. And it could be the one that particularly does that. And if we don't, the cost to all of us economically of being caught in the vice between Russia, China and an aggressive US, but politically and for our freedom would be catastrophic. So we have to be absolutely clear that these are savings we cannot afford to make.
And interesting, isn't it, that the UK, so Keir Starmer seems to have realised this quite recently,
yes.
Deciding to increase military spending, defence spending to 2.5%. We talked about this actually last week, and that's at the expense of the foreign aid budget. But really trying to push that and being so at the front of trying to win Trump over with negotiations and trying to persuade him, look, you know, we could put boots on the ground, but only if we've got US support, which is looking increasingly unlikely, isn't it?
I mean, it is looking unlikely, but the UK rhetoric has once again been ahead of reality there, because going to 2.5% of GDP is frankly nowhere near enough.
No. I mean,
most
they did
of
say
the expert
3%.
estimates look at the UK, even to meet its current NATO commitments, as being 3.8% of GDP. This is frankly laughable, what Starmer proposed.
Right.
If we want to have a credible nuclear deterrent with all three legs, the air, the sea and the land, and deployable forces, the UK would need far more. And what we've started to see from continental European countries, Germany yesterday among them, is far more serious increases in the kind of defence spending that we need. But we have to spend it right as well. We have to spend it quickly and we have to spend it smart.
And this, I mean, yeah, we should definitely hold up what happened in Germany last night. Yeah? So Germany's been pretty kind of absent the last 10 days or so because there's just been an election. There's going to be a new government here. That is a process that usually takes a couple of months to form a new government, but the situation is obviously so unstable, so intense in the world that the two parties that are likely to form this coalition, so the centre-right Conservatives and the centre-left Social Democrats, they've been on a kind of fast track to try to work out, OK, can we at least get the baseline of an agreement about what we would need to do to step up investment in two key areas, so in defence, but also in infrastructure, where Germany has serious deficiencies. And just last night, so they're not at the stage yet of saying, all right, we've got a coalition sorted, but last night they said, OK, we have come up with an agreement for a proposal for a huge fund to invest in German infrastructure, and then also to change the rules about, which are very strict in Germany, of the limits on government borrowing, to change those to allow a significant step up in defence spending. And the implication being that it would be well beyond what the UK
yeah, because they're talking
offered.
500 billion euros.
So 500 billion, so that's for infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's a bit more technical, what they've announced in terms of defence. So basically what they have said is that apart from the first 1% of GDP, so the first 1% of gross domestic product, everything beyond that going into defence would be exempted from any rules that exist before. And that means essentially the sky's the limit. I mean, they can spend as much as they
right?
and
whatever it takes.
Yeah. So Friedrich Merz used it. So he's the likely next chancellor. He used this expression, "whatever it takes," saying that in English. And for a lot of the kind of Europe nerds out there, what they heard there was an echo of what Mario Draghi, who was the chairman of the European Central Bank back in the days of the Euro crisis, so 10 plus years ago. I don't know if people remember this. There was a fear that the euro was going to collapse. There was this huge crisis going on in terms of how to deal with debts in various European countries that was a kind of knock-on effect of the financial crisis. Mario Draghi was the president of the European Central Bank. He came out and he said, we will do whatever it takes to stabilise the euro. And that calmed the markets down, that calmed the situation down. So I think very deliberate choice of words by Friedrich Merz there, because that was seen as a historic kind of shift in dealing with that euro crisis. He's trying to indicate this is the moment that we've got the message, we're taking it seriously, and this is like the big bazooka, yeah? Mm-hmm. We're taking
which will actually be spent on a big bazooka.
So then here you can get Ben to tell us all that they should be spending this on little drones and not big tanks and things like that. But that's the next discussion.
But so my question is, we've talked about Germany, we've talked about the UK. You're saying the UK is not taking it seriously enough in reality. But do you think that Europe is... I mean, they appear to suddenly be taking it very seriously. We had this meeting at the weekend in London. We've got a meeting tomorrow in Brussels. Are they taking it seriously enough? Are they reading the writing on the wall, which is that the US really does appear to be pulling out of what's been going on with
Parts of Europe are. And certainly the part that Richard mentioned then, and Germany's new leadership, Friedrich Merz, is taking this very seriously. We saw on election night, when I was happy to be here as well.
With Richard.
With Richard, indeed. Here we are again. Saying that we need to be independent of the US. I mean, for a staunch Atlanticist like Friedrich Merz to say that is a remarkable turn of events. To then back it up with this potentially historic move, maybe the actual Titan vendor for all those Germany policy watchers out there, the actual sea change in German foreign policy that we've been waiting for is huge. In the UK, they have shown rhetorical leadership and there has been a leadership of ideas, but it does need backup. But where is Italy? Where is Spain? Where are some of the others on this? Where is Macron beyond the rhetoric?
Because there have been complaints against France already that they've done a good talk, but they haven't even given that much military aid at all.
They haven't. They're also refusing to seize the frozen Russian assets, which would be a true statement of intent and would immediately put Europe at the table they claim to want to be at. Don't forget that France does have a more flexible nuclear deterrent than the UK, and what Macron has done is to float the idea this could potentially be put at European service. Now, the terms under which that would be done would be very tricky to negotiate, but it's really important to start considering it. And I certainly expect to see more talk of that from the major European powers and others who would want to join in about ensuring Europe has the nuclear deterrence it needs. But Richard's dead right. We need to be spending this money smartly, and I'm happy to say more about that in a second.
Do, please. You can talk about it now, unless you've got some
No,
questions.
I was just going to say, we can't forget as well about over the weekend I was on, and it was interesting talking to our correspondent, Terry Schultz, who reminded me not to forget that these talks on Thursday, there are two countries who may cause some issues, Hungary, of course, and Slovakia, so how to deal with that as well. That within the bloc, you mentioned it there, it's not 100% unity, we'll say.
No, it's not. There's a very uneven threat perception. There's a very uneven perception of urgency. But I think the patience for dealing with Hungary and Slovakia has snapped now. I don't think they're not the obstacle here, and they will be bypassed. Much like previously Orban has been in NATO, when Stoltenberg effectively said, if you keep blocking this, we'll ignore you publicly and you'll look a fool. I think that's going to be the attitude we'll see, because no one is going to waste time with them. And frankly, they're not strategically important in the European Union. Larger countries they can't do that with. Unfortunately, that's still the power reality of how that is. But coming to how we should actually do this to arm ourselves.
Yes, because to arm ourselves, but even before that, with this talk then of the US pulling out, and many of these questions here and what we've been talking about before, can Europe provide enough security and military support for Ukraine? Can Europe step in as the backstop, or is it not possible because they just don't have the equipment and capabilities that they need, unlike the US?
It's not impossible. There's plenty that could be done, and seizing those assets would be a great start to show intent, by the way. But the two things are actually intimately connected, how we arm Ukraine and how we arm ourselves. If you look at the reports that are coming out from Ukraine at the moment, over 60%, closer to 70% of Russian systems that are destroyed are currently being destroyed by drones. If you look at casualties on both sides, it's between 70 and 80% that are being caused by light drones, in fact. So not artillery, the old king of battle, not the heavy precision strike weapons, the expensive precision strike weapons, but drones. Now, you could say that's not a perfect learning example for the future, but it does point to some kind of shift in the character of warfare that we are seeing because of what's called the maturation of precision strike. And this used to be high-end capabilities you had to spend a fortune for. Now we can see the kind of drones we were hearing about in Munich, Richard, from Donaustahl or companies like this in Germany, which cost less than 2,000 euros and can destroy a 28 million euro tank. That imbalance is really important financially for Europe to bear in mind. Why would you invest in a 28 million euro tank if it can be so easily destroyed? Even by a hail of 100 or 1,000 of these drones, you would still get your value there. And we can actually produce these things at scale. What we have to do is reimagine our defence industrial base. So going beyond classic defence companies to use what's often talked about as a strength of Europe's, which is our industrial capacity, and to go basically faster, simpler, cheaper, smarter. That's the mantra for how we do this. And that stuff can use our advantages and work against Russia. That works for us as well as it does for Ukraine. And last point on that, it was interesting to see a German expert, Moritz Schularik from the Kiel Institute, talking about this today. He said, we need to be talking about 1 million drones, not 2,000 tanks.
And do you think that European leadership are listening to that?
It's a great question, because obviously governments and large defence companies, traditional defence companies, have quite close relationships. And the large defence companies have been screaming out for more money and more contracts for a long time. but they have to be able to show they can actually compete. There are many companies here in Germany. Helsing is one of the most well-known ones who work on AI and attack drones, who are really raring to go and ripe to grow. So there are some who have understood this message. I don't think we're all the way there yet. And we see it also in reports that say things like we need to replace the 1,400 tanks that the US will not be able to give us. Forget it. We don't have time to do that. And if we don't have time to do it, and if it's too expensive, it's not what we need. We have to get that message and start reforming the way that we fight as Europeans as well, because doctrine in NATO was always led by the US, doctrine being the way the military wants to fight. We outsource that to the US. They're not there anymore. So how do we actually want to fight, which needs to define then the goal we're trying to achieve, which is not just ready to defend against Russia, but it's able to defeat Russia within 3 to 5 years if we are actually going to have proper deterrence, because threat of defeat is the only true deterrent. That's what we have to work for.
I just want to jump in. We have a comment here just with regards to what we're talking about here with regards to arming, say, the European Union or Europe, I should say. We have a comment from Davos who says many Americans don't understand that the arming of Ukraine is actually good for the American economy. So obviously, you know, if you're saying it's good for the American economy, it would also be good for the European economy, right?
Hugely. And this is often a point of contention because some of the classic defence investment is said to crowd out other types of investment that is more economically productive, and this is an argument you hear from many economists. But we're at a time in Germany where, as Merz and others have said, Germany's economic model is broken. Germany's shedding jobs in the car industry, skilled jobs. That could be replaced by a lot of the traditional defence industry. But where the emerging defence industry comes in is its dual use. A lot of these things on robotics, a lot of the things on uncrewed systems or drones, on artificial intelligence, are about reclaiming tech leadership in the world in general. And if we know there's one thing Europe needs, it's more innovation and it's more competitiveness. This is a fantastic way to turbocharge that at the same time we secure ourselves.
Richard?
I mean, I just thought I'd just throw in a comparison from... I mean, discussions like this are not unique to Europe, you know. So Taiwan, for instance. So I've been to Taiwan a couple of times in recent years. And early last year, we spoke to... So there's a big debate in Taiwan that's partly being led by former leaders of the military, just saying that Taiwanese politicians have been investing too much money in these big, fancy weapon systems, whether it's submarines or jet fighters, stuff like that. But that is not what you need to deter China from attacking Taiwan. Because how do you deter China from that? Well, what Taiwan can do is try to make itself as difficult as possible to take over. And this is often called a porcupine strategy.
Yeah. So which is what Ursula von der Leyen
in fact, used the same expression. So, you know, if you're a leopard and you come across a porcupine, you might take one look at it and think, all right, I'm going to eat the rabbit over there instead of this porcupine, you know? So what is that? And that is, you know, and Ben could go into the details, but it's often much smaller, much less fancy weapons. It would be, you know, the relatively simple air defences that Ukraine relied on in the early stages of the war as well were I think, relevant in the Ukraine discussion. So there have been some lessons from Ukraine. And so these are debates that you have in a lot of countries where they face that kind of major threat, you know? So how do you turn, for instance, the Baltic states also into porcupines? You know?
Absolutely right. How do we forward defend against Russia? Because we don't want to be fighting on our territory. There's no strategic depth in the Baltics. Vilnius is 30 kilometres from the Belarusian border. How do we get the hail of fire, the unstoppable storm from above that could obliterate a Russian attacking force? How do we do what the Ukrainians have done and build homemade cruise missiles? Cheaper, much cheaper than, for example, the cruise missiles we're used to hearing about. All of that is going to be absolutely key to how we defend ourselves. The one thing where, in the immediate term, we do not have a replacement is in some of the so-called enablers. Logistics, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, network targeting, that kind of thing. But again, we shouldn't be looking to replace what the Americans could provide, but to get good enough effects from what we can do in the time we've got it. I mean, it was Teddy Roosevelt who said, you know, do what you can with what you have where you are. We have to take that mentality and not let the perfect become the enemy of the good.
And I guess one question is how long? I mean, we're in the midst of this. You know, we've just been talking about how intense this time is. This is a time of intense pressure and uncertainty and angst, worry. it's reminiscent a bit of the time around the invasion of Ukraine in the first place. Yeah. So that was the time where Olaf Scholz, the outgoing German chancellor, made this speech that Ben referred to a couple of times, where he called a Zeitenwende, so this German word that's become a real sort of symbol of this era. So a sea change or a turning point in history. And he made that speech just a few days after Russia had invaded. And that was at a time where it looked like Russia was going to take over Ukraine, that it would gobble up the whole country, and that you would have then Russia basically on the Polish border. That was the threat at that moment. And then, of course, the Ukrainians managed to push them back, And that was a spectacular success of the Ukrainians, but it also took the pressure off. It took off this sense of peril that the Russians were going to be really knocking on the door of the European Union. And I tell you one person who told me that story while I was in Washington. It is somebody who now works in the Department of Defense in the Trump administration. So, and this person was saying exactly that point. The Germans, they looked like they were about to take this all seriously with this, turning point, with a major investment and everything. But then the pressure came off.
Yeah.
He must have been reading that very good book called Turning Point, which says exactly that.
Who knows? But then the pressure came off. So it's one interpretation. Supporters of the Trump administration would say, what is this that we're witnessing from Trump? Well, in part, it is a absolute, they use the term maximum pressure usually with reference to Iran, but it's a version of this on Europe. Guys.
Is it just pressure, though? Is it just pressure?
It's probably going further, and it's probably going to abandonment. But this would be the kind of charitable interpretation of it. But still, whichever way it is, part of the justification would be, you've never taken this seriously. Ever since the end of the Cold War, what's been happening with your defence expenditure? Down to like 1% of GDP.
And they've got a point. But if it's not a bridge too far to perhaps speculate who you spoke to in the Department of Defense, then you could also make the claim that a lot of those in America who claimed this and who then said that Europeans are not good allies, who claim that America needs to pivot to China, they might be Asia prioritised, as it's known, or China prioritisers, but what they've done is open the door to isolationists.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this is going, to be honest. I don't think it's maximum pressure. It might be from Elbridge Colby and people like that, but beyond, it is actually the abandonment of the Western Alliance, and it's the abandonment of the free world.
And I think, this is the potential reality that Europe is looking at, that thinking that, OK, this is not just about the US trying to, lessen its footprint in Europe, complete the pivot that even Obama announced towards Asia, a decade and a half ago. But that it's more than that. But it is actually a sense that the US no longer sees, the Europeans as allies that really help it, really contribute to anything.
But the question there is, I'd be interested in other views on this. The question is why? Because earlier, Richard, you mentioned rightly that Trump and his team have talked about the opportunities of allying with Russia, basically, or aligning with Russia. Those are opportunities, economically as well as in security terms, pale into insignificance compared to the opportunities and the benefits of aligning with Europe.
Yeah,
so what is the difference? It's the values different.
Yeah, I think, partly, this is what J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference sort of indicated, that there's this sort of what they talk about a vibe shift in the United States, which has pulled it in a direction very far to the right of where Europe is, kind of at least baseline Europe is at the moment. And that, there are potentially more similarities between that and Russia. And this is another of the sort of shock moments that Europe has had in the last couple of weeks.
I want to jump in because we're getting some very interesting comments. I'm just going to throw a couple of out there because I know we're not specifically talking about NATO, but we sort of are.
Yeah, we are.
But NATO is dead. This is from Alan. No need to join whatsoever. And then another one from Davos. I think a NATO membership is the only good long-term option for Ukraine. So obviously differing views there. And then we have one from Ice Station Zebra who says, if Trump and Vance carry on like this, then the situation will escalate into World War III. Europe is more powerful than the US and Russia recognise. Time for Europe to get some self-belief. So there you go. There's some comments. They need to be,
hopefully they were listening to what you were saying before then.
I hope so. But indeed, belief is part of it. Deterrence basically comes in two ways, through a mixture of capabilities and resolve. Building the capability is usually a sign that you have the resolve, but we do need to embrace that strength that we actually have. That means playing to those strengths and showing ourselves what we can do. And so instead of moving at the pace of the slowest, the most cynical, the most complacent, those who can simply have to act. It is time for Europe to just do it.
Yeah. And I mean, just to return to your point, Ben, about the opportunities that the United States could see within Europe. I mean, if you compare the relationship that the United States has with Russia, the economic relationship is pretty much zero. It's trivial. The economic relationship between the US and Europe is gigantic. The amount of investment in both sides. The United States has a huge economic stake in Europe. So a really, a new European tragedy on the scale of the Second World War, which is what some fear if Russia is able to go on the rampage, after a sort of shabby deal in Ukraine. That would be hugely destructive to American interests because of the economic intertwining of the two sides. So yeah, this is one thing that on the one hand could give you pause about really having a maximalist interpretation about what the US is really trying to do. But on the other hand, that shows what's at stake.
Can I make a quick point to that? Because this is really important for people to understand. Indeed, Russia going on the rampage, as you put it, and causing World War II levels of destruction is one potential outcome. The other is a more Cold War type outcome, except we in Europe would all be on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. And it's about subjugation, it's about undermining of our democracies, our freedoms, etc. That is what Russia wants to use its military imbalance to achieve. They'd rather win without firing a shot. And that's actually what NATO was in itself first created to prevent, to stop countries getting picked off one by one through psychological blackmail based on an imbalance of forces. Yeah. And it's interesting, the comments about NATO, because that tension that was there is spot on, and it's actually unexamined by many security analysts. NATO is the best thing we've got, and we need to fix it right now, and it doesn't have a future, but Ukraine should join. This is not a credible way to go forward. No. The reason why NATO will continue to endure is because even though the current American government is trying to take their country very far away from the values of NATO, the values of the European Union, many American people don't agree with that. And we still have a relationship with Americans, an economic relationship, but also a kinship relationship for many, and a cultural relationship for many in Europe, that can potentially endure. And should the US come back from the dark side, then we, getting stronger in the meantime, will make us better allies for them in future and could potentially re-empower a NATO of the future. But for now, we can't rely on NATO, so we have to become strong ourselves.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end, but I'm hoping that we've still got Nick Connolly, who can hear me and was probably listening to a lot of that conversation, Nick. We were talking there. Ben was talking a lot about what Europe can do. We were discussing, for example, drone warfare, attack drones, which, of course, you and I have discussed a lot in the past, and what Ukraine has managed to do over the last 3 years. I really just wanted to sort of get your kind of takeaway on this. Coming back to Ukraine, Russia, the US and Europe, what do you expect to happen next? Do you think that there could be at least a ceasefire, or is that something that Zelensky and the Ukrainian government would not want until they have more assurances in place?
I'm pretty sceptical that the ceasefire is going to happen anytime soon, because I'm just not convinced that the Russian side is up for it either. We had Zelensky in that tweet where he was giving his apology to Trump, also picking up the idea from Macron about starting with a kind of provisional not on land ceasefire, so no strikes at sea, no strikes in the air, no attacks on energy infrastructure either in Ukraine or Ukraine's attacks against Russia's oil infrastructure. Let's see. I think that could be more realistic. These are the things that are kind of easier to actually make sure are being implemented, right? Because you've got a front line of over 1,000 kilometers. Making sure that there is not one single shot fired there is very, very difficult, even with the best intelligence in the world, to make sure that you can actually attribute who fired against whom. We saw that over and over again after 2014. There was never really a period where it was properly calm on the front lines. So I'm skeptical, but I think there is a real hope here in Ukraine that as we discussed, that kind of complacency in Europe is now out the door, out the window, that actually those scary kind of images from the Oval Office have shocked the Europeans into spending more and doing more. And one thing you hear time and time again here in Ukraine is, yes, we're grateful, yes, we have received a lot of money from Europe, but if you compare it to what Europe spent on the pandemic and on the kind of economic stimulus after the pandemic, it is more or less peanuts. It is even less, as Trump has even spoken about, Europe sends less money to Ukraine than it has supposedly for Russian energy since the war began. So I think there's a need for a lot more money. It's going to be painful explaining that to European taxpayers, but there's going to be more money needed, and from a Ukrainian perspective, hopefully European boots on the ground here rather than just promises.
Nick, thank you very much for joining us. We'll let you go, but we really appreciate it, and I'm sure we'll be speaking again very soon. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye.
And I'd just love to put that question to both of you then as we wrap up. What do you expect to happen next in this? Ben.
Thanks very much. Predicting what's going to happen next in this last couple of weeks is not
unpredictable. I will predict that.
It's the one thing you can rely on, right? Yeah, indeed. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire either, because I don't think the terms will be there that Ukraine can properly agree to. I agree with what Nick Connolly said, that Russia is not actually interested in that. Unless it gets such unfavourable terms out of Ukraine that it can reconstitute its forces, as we said before, while subjugating a lot of Ukraine. And I don't think the Ukrainians are up for that. So I think it's unlikely to happen. What I expect is Europe to step up. And I think the signs that we saw not only in Berlin yesterday, but from Brussels, where Ursula von der Leyen announced this new 150 billion loan package for weapons to be bought around Europe, plus the opening up fiscal room for member states of the European Union to do more. These signs are coming thicker and faster and stronger, that there is actually willingness to move forward on behalf of those who get it. And I think that will continue to develop momentum because they understand the threat. I expect if we get the chaperoning of, to come back to the beginning of the show, of Macron and Starmer, it's an interesting first date, isn't it? Macron, Starmer and Zelensky, then I would expect Macron and Starmer to get slapped down by Trump too. Yeah. And I think what any European leader looking at that clip from the Oval Office should have worked out is that could be me.
Yeah.
And that's why we can't trust what this guy's doing.
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, predicting what's going to happen is, I guess, pretty much impossible at this stage. But I think in terms of what will we learn in the next couple of weeks, I think if we do start to see, I mean, if Nick and Ben are right that it's going to be very difficult to get a ceasefire, then maybe we'll start to see whether, in which direction Trump is willing to go with those sticks and carrots. As kind of said at the beginning, at the moment, the attitude to Ukraine is all the sticks and it's all the carrots to Russia. And, is there a context in which, we start to see Trump willing to use any sticks whatsoever? So Waltz, for instance, the National Security Advisor, saying, as we were saying earlier, OK, if we do get to the point of setting a date, at least for a set of talks, then they would consider unpausing this military aid. If they actually did something like unpausing military aid, that might be just a glimmer of encouragement to some that it's not all,
it's not all
in
lost.
One direction or the other. If that point never arrives, then it gets more concerning for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans. Yeah.
Thank you both very much. Poll. We had a poll. We need the results of that.
Thank you for reminding me, and thank you, Michelle, for reminding me in my ear as well. Cherry Chan, of course, is in charge of this, but is not here at the desk today. So we put the question to our viewers, and it was, what's the one thing Ukraine shouldn't back down on in peace talks? What I find the big takeaway for me is how fairly evenly distributed it is. Keeping all its territory, 29%. Getting US security guarantees, 26%. No concessions, period, 23%. And its ambition to join NATO with 20%. So I don't know if that surprises you guys. It surprises me, actually, a little bit.
But it's the uncertainty over those last two things you mentioned that I think is playing on people, right?
There you go.
Can we trust NATO? Can we trust the US?
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, for coming in to be with us. Thank you, Richard. Thanks. Really good discussion. Thank you to Nehal and also to Pablo and, of course, to Cherry, who's not here. Thank you to you for watching. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your questions and for your comments.
Thank you. And of course, I nearly forgot. Hang on. Of course, we'll be posting our what we'll be talking about next week, 24 hours before. That'll be on our community post on our YouTube, DW's YouTube channel. So do make sure to tune in there next week. And of course, we'll be back next week with with a new topic. Who knows what it'll be? Because at the moment,
who knows? Everything is changing by the second.
Yeah,
but we'll see you next week.
Intense times.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Take care.